Hello, my name is Yoshi Bauer. Welcome to the My Special Needs Connection webinar and podcast series. As a parent of children with special needs and as a professional advocate, I understand the challenge of connecting parents and professionals with the information that they need to serve children and adults with special needs. At My Special Needs Connection, we empower parents and professionals through valuable instruction and insights of experts in the special needs community. We're excited to come alongside you to provide you with information that you need. Let's grow through the exchange of knowledge and the hope of success. Be sure to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel for new releases. Please enjoy our webinars and podcasts.
Okay, I think we can get started. I want to thank you all for attending this live webinar. We have some new information in sort of an ever-changing world on COVID, distance learning, schools opening for the fall, what's required. Fortunately, we have some new law, some new authority that I think is going to be helpful. And that was just brought out about a month ago. And so I think it's helpful that we've got a new standard out there, but we'd like to make it practical for you all. I know it's kind of overwhelming probably with all the changes that have happened, but my job tonight is to give you sort of an overview of the new law and how that applies. And then Yoshi Bauer, she's a special education advocate, and she's going to be kind of talking about the practical nuts and bolts, how to use this information that has come out in the law in an IEP meeting, what to ask for, how to use that, for your child's benefit. So with that, we'll get started. So I'm Thomas Nelson. I'm a special education attorney. I've been practicing law for about 35 years, and about 20 of those years in special education. And I love to give parent informational trainings. I've spoken before the Epilepsy Foundation, CHAD, Learning Disabilities Association, Autism Society, the Down Syndrome Society, and have trained lawyers, other special education lawyers through the San Diego Volunteer Lawyers Association. So I'm happy to be here and share some information that I have and the research that I've done. And I just want to mention too that every situation is different. There are nuances to every situation. So, what we're presenting tonight is not intended to be legal advice for your particular situation. If you need to speak to a lawyer, that's the way to go. And when you present questions, try to make the question frame so that it can help kind of the group rather than, getting too specific into your own particular child situation. We would appreciate that. So having said that, I'd like to turn it over to Yoshi Bauer. She's a special education advocate who has a lot of experience. I learned from her as well. And so I'm going to turn it over to her, let her talk a little bit about her background, and then she's going to talk about, where we've been since schools closed in March, how we got there, and where are we going. So Yoshi, if you could go ahead and get started, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yoshi Bauer. I'm a special needs advocate. I worked for many years in San Diego Unified in special education. I have 2 adult children with Down syndrome. And I founded the website My Special Needs Connection, which is a way for parents to get some resources from professionals. We offer a whole list of webinars from various professionals on our website. And so one of the issues that has really been prevalent the last few months from all of my clients, of course, is the distance learning. Just as a background, back in March, teachers were literally, and parents were literally just told in the morning that, hey, today's your last day of school for we don't know how long. And then from that point, as you know, we have not been able to get back in school. And for a long time, teachers were not even allowed to get back into school. They were told, take what you need today. And it was literally several weeks before they even got back in to get some more things. So, needless to say that this distance learning has been tough on everybody, from teachers to the parents to the students. But there was a couple things that we wanted to start out with letting you know. And that number one is the laws, state laws and federal laws regarding IEPs have not changed in any way. The U.S. Department of Ed had a chance to and refused to alter or restrict or waive any requirements of IDEA. So it all is still in effect, and same with the state laws. But there has been a lot of confusion. There's been a lot of just plain falsehoods that have been, perpetuated by school districts and things like that. But recently in the state of California, our governor in a bill actually put some more requirements out there about what distance learning needs to look like. And in addition, has offered more health guidelines and things like that for when students can return to in-person learning. So what we want to do right now is just, I want to turn it over to Tom and have him just go through the new legislation, the new health guidelines, things like that, that have been put in place to make sure that distance learning is not as chaotic as it has been.
Yeah. Thanks, Yoshi. And I think chaotic is a good word. There really has been little direction since schools closed in March. It hit hard and it hit fast. There were some guidance, loose guidance issued by federal and state agencies, and some orders even from Governor Newsom. But what it established was often confusing set of expectations that in essence required school districts to offer some form of meaningful distance learning instruction. But that form was very vague, the standards weren't set, and as probably happened with most of you whose children are on IEPs, it was chaotic. There weren't very good guidelines and standards were not really set. So what happened is that the legislature in California created a bill, and it's called SB 98. And basically, by contrast, it set forth certain new distance learning obligations on districts, applicable to all students, including students with disabilities. So it sets forth parameters for school reopening. And it's basically in response to the failures, to the lessons, that we learned from distance learning from back in March. And so it's good news. It's good news in the sense that now, even if we have distance learning going in the future, which it looks like it's here to stay for at least quite a while, even if it's just in a hybrid form, meaning some in-person and some distance learning, it's going to be around for a while. So the good news is we finally have some standards that we can work with. And so just getting started, let me turn to PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So as I mentioned, it was passed on June 29th, and that's when the governor signed the bill. So it sets forth requirements applicable to distance learning for the 2021 school year. What's interesting is that this same bill contains language that suggests the legislature intended to impose substantial limits on distance learning. So, for example, there's a section of SB 98 that says that LEAs or the school district shall offer in-person instruction and may offer distance learning pursuant to requirements. Another section says that the district shall offer in-person instruction to the greatest extent possible. So these two provisions basically set forth a strong legislative intent that the district should be moving towards in-person learning to the greatest extent possible. And I think the reasons for that are obvious, just that, you know, with in-person instruction, there tends to be a stronger instruction base. So while SB 98 does contain standards for distance learning, overall, it's clear that the legislature wants the schools to move towards in-person instruction to the greatest extent possible. But what they did is they did say there are some instances where distance learning, you know, might be necessary. So let's take a look at that. There's a code section in SB 98. It adds code section 43503, and it basically states the two circumstances where distance learning is allowed. The two circumstances where distance learning is allowed, number one is where the district or school-wide level, as a result of an order or guidance from state public health officer or local public health officer. So the first exception is there's some kind of order or guidance that requires the distance learning. We're going to talk about in a minute, you know, a guidance from Governor Newsom that came out a couple days ago that talks about school size, about, you know, 14 children and 2 adults in a classroom. There's also, I'm sure you've heard about guidance from the California Department of Public Health about social distancing and 6 feet apart. So as you can imagine, it's going to be difficult for schools to reopen now like they did before March, because how are you going to have the classroom size and accommodations to afford social distancing, to afford, you know, Governor Newsom's recent guidelines on 14 students to a classroom and 2 adults, to, you know, the normal setting. So at least for now, it's clear that there's going to be at least a hybrid model if schools reopen, just because of this one exception. The second exception is for students who are medically fragile. Obviously, children, you know, who are at high risk of medical problems, medical issues. It could be very dangerous if they, you know, get COVID. Those students can opt for distance learning. There's no requirement that they have to go back to in-person instruction. It also includes students who would be put at risk. So you don't have to show that you're medically fragile. If you can show that the child would be put at risk, that's sufficient. And from my reading of the legislature, this is interpreted very broadly. So it could even be a situation where you have family members that are, let's say, have some medical issues, whether it be diabetes or heart conditions that would make them really susceptible to dangerous outcomes from COVID. So it could even be the child's family that they live with put at risk, or self-quarantine. So what you get from these exceptions is that they're pretty broad. Although the legislature is really set on going back to an in-person learning model, there are these exceptions, and they're pretty broad. So that's why, and we'll get to in a minute, why they put forth standards for distance learning, because they knew that that's going to happen. It's going to happen for sure for the near future, at least.
I have a question about that. I have been hearing from a lot of parents that they have been getting prior written notices, or they have been receiving letters from school districts saying they must choose either, to do online, or at some point, if the school will open up, that they have to choose either in person or or online, and that they cannot switch at least for the first semester. Is that something that a school district can legally do?
Well, I would say no. I mean, there's no set requirement for a time frame for that, and nor is there a set time frame necessarily for an IEP. In other words, an IEP, yes, it is intended, for a 1-year program, but at any time the district or the parent can change that, agree to change that IEP because of circumstances. So it's never set in stone. So obviously there's going to have to be a decision as to whether it's distance learning, in person, or a hybrid when school gets underway. But that can change. If, for example, let's say that the parent chooses distance learning, and as time goes on, the parent realizes that their child really isn't accessing their education. It's just not working. I would recommend calling an IEP and saying, you know what, we tried it. It didn't work. Here's, the proof that it didn't work. We need to go back to in-person or at least a hybrid model. Vice versa, you could start with in-person. Maybe the child isn't able to wear a mask, isn't able to socially distance, isn't able to adequately protect themselves or others in the school setting. Might need an IEP meeting to say, you know what, we tried the in-person, it just doesn't seem like it's safe, and we need to move to a distance learning model. These are guidelines that came out just a couple days ago for instruction. And it talks about cohorts. Cohorts meaning the group of students and adults in a particular classroom. And according to these guidelines, cohorts must be limited to no more than 14 students and no more than 2 supervising adults. So that's considered a cohort. How many students, how many adults? And under this guidance, it's 14 students and no more than 2 adults. These cohorts can't interact with other groups. The supervising adults in that cohort, that group, aren't allowed to mix with other cohorts. They have to be, separate for activities such as art, and music, and exercise. So obviously, you can see that they're trying to avoid the mixing, trying to avoid groups mixing with other groups, keeping them, somewhat isolated and separated. They have to be the physical distancing between children in the same cohort. Should be balanced with developmental and socio-emotional needs. Physical distancing between adults must be maintained to the greatest extent possible. Adults and students must wear face covering. But I thought this was interesting. The last one was one-to-one specialized services can be provided to a child or youth by a support provider that is not part of the cohort. So I think that's an important provision right there, because let's say there's 2 teachers in the classroom and 14 students, but 2 of those students or one of those students needs a one-on-one aid, and you scratch your head and you go, well, we can't add any more adults if there's only 2 adults and 14 children allowed. But this says that a one-on-one aid is not part of that formula. You can bring in a one-on-one aid and have actually more than 2 adults in the classroom if that's what the child needs. So keep that in mind if your child has a one-on-one aid on their IEP or needs a one-on-one aid on their IEP.
And that refers to also speech, OT, the service providers can come in. But it's important to note one-to-one. So they can no longer come in and take your student and then take another student and pull them into a separate setting and work with them in a small group. But yes, it can be services and service providers.
Right. So let's talk now just about the distance learning requirements. As I mentioned before, we finally have some teeth to the standard. It's not just a loosey-goosey. I mean, Yoshi mentioned a little bit about just how the background is pretty chaotic. I mean, we've both heard of situations where the students would just watch a video. That was their instruction. The teacher was nowhere to be found. You just log on and watch a video of something on the internet, and that was your instruction. Or maybe you got nothing, or maybe there was a speech language provider that just, I've heard, provided a joke of the day for the students. I mean, it was just all over the map. So finally, we have this SB 98, which puts some teeth in distance learning and really tries to make it, as close as possible to what a child could get in an in-person setting. And so I'm just going to go quickly through some of the components of this distance learning requirements. So first of all, access of all pupils to connectivity and devices so they can participate in the educational program. Not necessarily an issue in San Diego County, but there were counties in California where they were so remote that they couldn't even get connected to any kind of distance learning. And so districts now, those districts are required to have mobile hotspots. I mean, there actually are, vans or whatever driving out to those areas and providing connectivity because it is now a requirement. Secondly, the content has to be aligned to grade level standards that's provided a level of quality and intellectual challenge equivalent to in-person instruction. So you see right there that we're now requiring distance learning to look a lot like in-person instruction. You can't just forget about grade level standards anymore. That may have happened before, but it can't happen now. So it has to be challenging. It has to be rigorous. A level of quality that's equivalent to in-person instruction. So remember, when your IEP, we'll talk about this towards the end of the webinar, but remember, you might want to bring something like this into your IEP because these are the requirements that are going to have to be addressed and provided in your child's IEP with distance learning. Whether it be completely distance learning or a hybrid model, this has to be provided. Other supports designed to address the needs of pupils who are performing below grade level or need support in other areas. So again, targeting the children that are not at grade level. They need help, they need supports, and distance learning has to provide that. Special education related services and any other services required by a pupil's individualized instruction or educational program. And I like this part, with accommodations necessary to ensure that the IEP can be executed in a distance learning environment. So they have to not only create, a program that is required under the IEP, but they better make sure that they have the accommodations available so that IEP can be implemented or executed in a distance learning environment. And I wanted to ask Yoshi just her input on parent training, because I think that's a big part of some of the difficulties and problems that have been presented under distance learning.
You are acting as the teacher de facto. Yes, there's got to be training, and that is included later on in the bill that there has to be some training.
Good. And then finally, daily live interaction with certificated employees and peers for purposes of instruction, progress monitoring, and maintaining school connectiveness. So gone are the days where the distance learning program can just be, oh, go watch this video and answer some homework questions, and then we'll talk about it in a week or so. No, every day there has to be some live interaction in the distance learning model. Now, the legislature didn't say how many minutes per day. It didn't say, that it had to be the teacher. It could be some other certificated employee, like a speech language therapist, or occupational therapist, maybe the school psychologist. But there has to be somebody, some certificated employee and peers that provide daily live instruction. So again, you can see how it's changed. It's, the legislature realized some of the complaints and problems One of which was there was no daily live instruction. There was maybe no live instruction for months, but now it is a requirement. I don't know. Do you have any points on these requirements, Yoshi? Just some thoughts.
Well, yeah, and I will add those later on when I talk about the IEP process and how to make this personal. You know,
Okay.
as we're going over all of this, this is what the law says, and we're telling you what the laws have said now in the guidelines. But I will then tell you how to make this personalized for your own IEPs.
Learning continuity and attendance plan. This is another part of SB 98. And basically, each school district has to create this plan by September 30th, 2020. And we'll talk about what has to be in that plan in a minute. But again, the legislature's like, we want to make sure these school districts are doing their job. We want to make sure there's accountability. We want to make sure that there's some plan being followed. So the legislature basically crafted this plan. We'll talk about what's in it in a minute, but they had, I think, until what was it, August, the end of August, to create a template. I think actually it was maybe earlier August. That has been done. So the Department of Education has created a template for this learning continuity and attendance plan, and they've submitted it to all school districts in the state of California. Now it's up to each school district to explain how they're going to implement this plan. And in a little bit, Yoshi's going to talk about what that means for your child and how you can use this plan specifically for your child's programming. But basically, it includes, as I mentioned here in the slide, addressing the gaps in learning, the needs of students with unique needs, providing access to devices and connectivity, kind of what we talked about just a minute ago, and providing resources and supports to address student and staff mental health and social emotional well-being. So I'm going to get into the specifics here now of what is contained in the plan. So here are the key provisions. These are not the total list. I mean, there's some things about school meals and so on and so forth, but I thought I would just focus on, you know, what would be probably most meaningful for your child's IEP. So here are the key provisions. This learning continuity plan that the districts have to create and submit by September 30th. Probably, I know some school districts have already done it and they have it up on their website. It does have to be published so parents can see it, can access it. But first of all, the description how the school district will provide continuity of learning and address the impact of COVID-19 on pupils and the specific actions they will take to support its ability to address those impacts. So they have to address, you know, the impact of COVID-19 and how what actions they're going to take to address, you know, the impacts. And learning loss, we're going to look at in a minute, is one of the biggies. That's one of the things that the legislature really focused on, is how are you going to address the issue of learning loss? Secondly, the actions the school district will take to offer classroom-based instruction whenever possible, particularly for pupils who have experienced significant learning loss due to school closures. So that kind of goes back to my first or second slide about the emphasis of the legislature was, you know, to the greatest extent possible, in-person learning. So they have to start, you know, describing and talking about the actions they're going to take to offer that instruction, in-person instruction. And, you know, that might mean how they're going to set up the classroom or what precautions they're going to take. But, you know, it has to be addressed, and particularly for those students who really suffered a pretty significant learning loss. Then for distance learning, how the school district will provide continuity of instruction during the school year to make sure that pupils have access to a full curriculum, substantially similar quality, regardless of the method of delivery. So again, full curriculum, Substantially similar quality, I think that means to, the in-person instruction. So again, you can see that that bar has been raised for distance learning. It's no longer a wishy-washy, do what you want. It's interesting. I was talking to a parent today. I'll just throw this in now, but they called the period of distance learning, they called it crisis learning. And I think they use that term because I think maybe they want to sort of deflect responsibility. Crisis, meaning, boy, we couldn't do anything. Well, I think with these laws that we're talking about, if those days ever existed where they could sort of do whatever they wanted and not be held accountable, that may not be the case, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they're certainly over now. There is a strict requirement for what these school districts have to provide in distance learning, and the legislature didn't call it crisis learning. And finally, for distance learning, what additional supports for pupils with exceptional needs served across the full continuum during the period in which distance learning is provided. So what are those additional supports that children with exceptional needs require? Just a couple more points. It's a pretty long statute. How the educational agency will measure learning status, particularly in the areas of English language arts, English language development, mathematics. Leoshi, I think we'll be talking about this in a minute, but there has to be some measurement of the status of the child, in these core academic areas. The districts can't just say, well, gee, we're in this distance learning model. We can't really assess. We can't really figure it out. We don't know where the student, is performing right now, but, we'll worry about that in a year. No, the district has to create a model for measuring that learning status. What actions and strategies the agency will use to address learning loss and accelerating learning progress as needed. So here again is that issue of learning loss that I mentioned earlier. What actions and strategies will they use to address that learning loss? Yoshi again is going to talk about how you can use that in your child's IEP, but that is something that they have to discuss. They have to address with each child on an IEP. And then finally, how the effectiveness of the services or supports provided to address learning loss will be measured. Actions and strategies the agency will use to address learning loss and accelerate learning progress, and how those strategies will differ for students with disabilities. So you can see there's a lot of requirements. I get the feeling that the legislature didn't want to just leave it up to the district, to come up with any vague plan that they wanted. They're like, okay, we're going to do it for you. We're going to step by step make sure that you cover, these critical components, and we're going to set them forth in a template to you, and you're going to fill them out, and that's a requirement. So again, you can see mitigating learning loss is really on the minds of the legislature, because that's kind of the presumption that during the distance learning period there was probably some learning loss. Anything you want to add to this, Yosh?
Just that, when I talk about this, I will go over some of the ways, because this again is an overall plan that they have to have. It really is going to be up to parents to say, hey, this is what I want. I need this specific assessment, or this is where I feel the loss is, because while they have this overall plan, they most likely will not come to the table, or even if you don't call an IEP, they most likely will not offer it.
Good. I think you'll talk a little bit more about how to address these particular components in an IEP for your particular child, because it does really translate into a specific child, doesn't it? Compensatory education. It's generally defined as educational services above and beyond that normally due to a student resulting from a denial of FAPE. FAPE is an acronym for free, appropriate public education. So you can think of, the word appropriate. Every child has unique needs, and the school district has to construct an IEP program to meet the individual needs of each disabled student. And so typically, compensatory education addresses those situations where the district didn't provide that appropriate program for the student. And compensatory education is basically a way of placing the student in the position they would have been had the school provided the appropriate services. So, for example, if a child was supposed to get speech and language on their IEP and for whatever reason the district didn't provide it, that might be an example of a situation where compensatory education would be due. And that could be in the form of speech language services above and beyond what's on the IEP, because there was some loss. There wasn't, the service was not provided. And so they have to make up for that loss. And the law basically considers compensatory education on a case-by-case basis. They look at the needs of the student, the context and length of lapse of services that occurred. If the student missed, for example, one session of speech language, compensatory education might look very different than if a student missed a whole semester. So it does, factor in things like that, students' present levels and progress on annual goals. But it has to be addressed. And I'm going to cover just quickly, some of the different guidelines or rules that have discussed compensatory education. And you can see that it is going to be a topic for the IEP. The IEP team really can't say, oh, well, it's not a topic for discussion. We don't really have to address it. It's not necessary, or it's not really appropriate to do it in an IEP. No, if you look at these guidelines, it is going to be a topic. It doesn't necessarily mean that every parent is going to obtain compensatory education for their children, but it does have to be discussed. So if you go back to the Department of Education, and this is months ago, they said that once school resumes, the district should plan to make individual determinations with the IEP team whether compensatory education services may be needed. Doesn't say it has to be provided, but it says you got to talk about it. Are they required? The Department of Education, they said that the team may be required to make an individual determination whether compensatory education services are needed. And when there's a delay in services, they have to make a determination whether compensatory education services may be needed when school resumes. And then the LCP, the Learning Continuity Plan, which we just covered, again, they have to address the actions and strategies to address learning loss, the effectiveness of those supports to address learning loss, the strategies to address learning loss and accelerate learning progress, and how these strategies differ for students with disabilities. So you've got a lot of authority saying, look, this is a topic of discussion for the IEP team. It has to be considered and has to be discussed. So, I wouldn't take no for an answer that they just won't discuss it, because I think it's pretty clear that it is a topic of discussion. Typically, as I mentioned before, it's been awarded as a result of a denial of FAPE. Denial of FAPE does not necessarily mean fault, but that's kind of the term that most people think of. It's a little bit different here, because I don't know that you have to show any fault. I mean, the Department of Education, the CDE, SB 98 say, districts have to address it. And they don't really mention a denial of FAPE. They just say you got to talk about it based on learning loss. So, it might look a little bit, if you've heard of extended school year or ESY services, it's where a child would regress if they don't have services. over the summer. It might be a standard somewhat like that. Some lawyers have proffered that that might be sort of the standard that the judges look at. So, things looking at, did the child regress, fail to make meaningful progress? Did they become disengaged from the learning process, so they need additional programming or supports to re-engage? Those are just some things to consider or think about in terms of, compensatory education. I think that um, in just conclusion, I would say that not every child's going to need compensatory services. I mean, some children have done, fairly well during the distance learning, in spite of the district maybe, but, it hasn't necessarily hampered their progress. But other children, it's been just a disaster. So I think, the law is probably going to look at what is the child's learning loss, and what was the quality, of the programming proffered by the district. And I think, the greater the child's regression, and maybe the less robust that the special education and related services were during the closures, the more likely that, a judge might say, district, you have to compensate this child for the effects of the closures. So I think now Yoshi's going to talk a little bit about just where do we go from here? How do we, address the IEP and implement some of these things? And you want me to go to the next slide, Yoshi?
Yeah, sure. So what I want to do is I want to talk about the next steps are for you to take that distance learning plan, your district's learning continuity plan, and any possible compensation, and make that individualized in your student's IEP. So the first thing is to call an IEP meeting. And yes, they have 30 days to do this. And some schools may be back in session by then. In-person learning, there's a lot of different things going on. Poway is saying that they're going to begin as soon as September 8th in school in-person learning with elementary, and staggering. But regardless, you want to call an IEP right away. Again, call that IEP meeting. Okay. And as you're preparing for that IEP meeting, what you need to do is gather some data of your own. And some of the data that you can do is keeping track. Just keep a simple log about how many times and how much, how the service provider. So how much speech time did you get, and was it one-on-one, and what did it consist of? Was there anything in, in anything working on goals? You can videotape your students' Zoom meetings that they have and show that, they could not pay attention after the first 5 minutes. One of the issues that I found is that the district haven't been keeping any data up to this point. And again, it's another false thing that I have heard out there is that districts have been telling parents, well, really all of this distance learning that we had so far and the ESY was strictly just for maintaining and not meant for making progress. Well, as I said in the beginning, the district or the federal government nor the state did not waive anything, any requirements for IDEA. So your student's education is still, and was supposed to be during that time, it was supposed to be fashioned for your student to make progress. Now, we understand that this is unprecedented times and a difficult time. So while I believe, and I think Mr. Nelson had mentioned that a little while ago about, the hearing officers are not going to really be harsh on schools for that period of time. However, the issue is, because a lot of districts felt that, they didn't keep any data for the last several months of school that they did online and distance learning. So whatever you have is helpful. And for instance, like I have talked to teachers who were doing the seesaw with students online, and I said, well, how do you know when you do these things and you give the students, or how do you know that they're getting the right answers? Well, we don't know that. We didn't. So they're not keeping track of some of that. So you can take pictures of the computer screen and work that your student is doing if you have private BCBAs, behavior specialists that are coming out to your house, have them observe and have them write up about how they think this is going and what they've seen. So this is all information that you can gather. If your student has adaptive skills goals or social goals, you know, those are things that you can keep data on yourself and say, hey, no, they've regressed, they're not able to do this. So you need to keep that data for sure, okay, and keep track of that. And then again, you need to figure out what did the school keep. You can still request provider logs. Providers should still be keeping some forms of logs about how long they were on, what goals were they working on. Okay, so the next thing that you're going to do is you're going to ask for assessments. You're going to want especially academic assessments, but often assessments in all areas. I know of some people who did not receive a properly working assisted communication device when we went out on distance learning. And so all of this time has gone by, including ESY, where their student couldn't access. So a lot of the communication goals may be, you know, not being close to being met, or they may have regressed in that area. So ask for assessments. One of the things
by the way, I was just going to mention quickly, Yosh, you know, you put these requests in writing. If you want, you know, provider logs, records, school records, make a written request. If you want an assessment or assessments, make it the request in writing. I don't want to assume that you all know that how important it is to put it in writing. You don't want to just make a phone call. You want to put it in writing.
Right. And then what you want to do is you want to say, you know, that you know, that if they are not going to give, if they're not willing to assess, and I've heard that's another falsehood as a district are saying, well, we cannot assess online, we can't assess virtually. And if they say that, then you can request an IEE. I have spoken to several, both Tom and I have spoken to several private providers in the last week or so who have said, yes, they are coming up with ways to be able to assess online. And so these things can be done. And so if the district refuses, you can request in writing an IEE, because what you're looking for is to get current baselines on goals. Because again, another falsehood that was said was that, you know, we can't work on all the goals. Well, legally, there was no provision that you didn't have to work on all the goals. So, you know, we need new baselines. We need to have, you know, the current functioning. Where is your student functioning currently? Because that may have changed. So there, San Diego Unified has talked about the cohort today, and they said that what they're treating that guideline is that they have a number of people, a small percent that they're going to bring back into schools, and they said it will be some students with special needs, some who are homeless, some students who have regressed according to their last couple of report cards, and I thought it was interesting. They said if you haven't been notified, then you're not one of them. And they talked about bringing some students back who needed assessment. Well, you know, if you all ask for assessments, then they're going to have to somehow figure out how your students get to do some in person too, within all of this. So very important that you request those assessments, and that you request an IEE if you don't get these things. And again, for anything, if they say no, that they won't give you an IEE, or they say no, that they're not going to give you an assessment, or they refuse to talk about compensatory, anything, ask for a prior written notice. Tell them you want a prior written notice where they have to detail in writing why they are refusing your request. Okay. And for those who don't know, that an IEE is an independent educational evaluation, and what the law says is that if you don't agree with, and this is how you will phrase it, I'm not in agreement with either your assessment that you did, or because there again, they might say, okay, we're going to assess, but we're just going to assess very informally, like with a records review, which won't help because the records they have are not based on current data. So if they either refuse to assess or they don't assess properly, then you say you don't agree with that, and you request in writing and an independent educational evaluation, whereas when that's granted, the district will have to pay for you to go to private providers to have those assessments done. So at any rate, we want to do that. You want to ask from this point on, how is the school going to measure learning status? What, you know, and particularly in core curriculum, and for students who are in Gen Ed too, you know, how are you going to measure this going forward for my student? How are you going to measure how they're learning? What kind of data are you going to keep? Okay. So, Tom, you can go ahead and go to the next screen.
Next one. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, one of the things that you want to prepare for is programming for the virtual learning and how you fit all of that into your IEP. So, confirm your connectivity to learning. So, the district is responsible for making sure that you have the proper technology to be online. Okay, so they have IT departments, which are their technology gurus, so they can connect you with those people to help you to establish your online system and to make sure that you have everything that you need. The school has to replace any equipment that they've given you in a really timely manner that doesn't work, and they have to tell you how to use it and make sure that you understand how to use it. You want to make sure that your IEP is aligned and that the goals are still aligned towards grade level standards. And again, it's really important that, so what this bill has said is that the district doesn't have to call an IEP simply to address this. But if it is a normal IEP, so if you have an annual or triennial coming up, or if a parent calls an IEP, then they have to address these things. But it's important to know that that doesn't mean anything's going to change. So they don't get to come in and say, well, because of distance learning, we have to change all your goals and everything else. That is not the intent of what this bill is. So you're talking what the current needs are to, you know, see if there's any more needs, and then you have to figure out how to meet all of those needs going forth in the same manner appropriately with progress that you put in in-person learning. Okay, so making sure that it's provided at a level of quality and intellectual challenge. So again, you know, when I mentioned that falsehood before of saying, well, it's just to maintain, that's not true anymore, you know, and it never has been, but this bill makes it very clear. They need to challenge your student. They need to make sure that the student is learning and not just repeating things that they already knew. It has to be for progress. Okay, they should be learning new things. They should be being challenged academically. So then we talk about what related services and accommodations are necessary. Now, this is what I consider the most important thing. And we also talk about the academic supports. Okay, and I know a lot of you are having questions about these things. So look at the academic supports in your student's IEP. What are those supports? Do they need notes or a note taker? Do the questions have to be read to them when they take a test? Do they have a one-on-one aid? Do they need front loading for vocabulary or small group instruction? Okay, so those, if they need those things and those accommodations, the district must find a way to do that. The one-on-one aid situation has been a really complicated issue because, of course, you can't have the aid come to your house. And so they're being really underused. One of the things that you can insist on is that there is, so if you have a student, say, that is included in general ed time, okay, that there is then a session afterwards with the one-on-one aid to do these things, to go back over, the aid can be taking notes. The aid can then break off into a small session. These are things that have to be accounted for, these academic supports that your student may have. They need to get your student the notes before, you know, if your student is in a general ed class and not able because of an auditory processing issue to take notes. These things need to be done. If you have accommodations such as repeating, you know, repeating the questions or the directions in a variety of ways, or checking for comprehension, these things need to be done, and that I'll talk about that in a minute, how you do that with your daily live interaction, but those things need to be done.
Yoshi, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Can I ask you a question? So let's assume that the student has, severe attention problems attending to distance learning online instruction. And we understand the issue you raised about the district not, providing a one-on-one aid into the home. But what about, is there any responsibility in your mind to potentially look at private providers? Because there are companies that will allow, their employees, one-on-one aides, trained ABA, so on and so forth, to go in the home and assist the child in accessing their education.
Yes, and the possibility of a compensatory where the district provides or pays outside aides to come in, and that is something I will talk about in a minute. But yes, those are things to ask for too. So when you're talking about accommodations, okay, again, we talk about these academic ones, and we want to know how they're going to account for that. How are they going to include those? And you want that in writing in the IEP, okay? You want to talk about the other supports that they may have. Does your student have OT supports? Do they need a wiggle chair in order to pay attention, or weighted vests, or weighted toys, or sensory toys? Do they need a slant board, or do they need adapted paper or adapted writing utensils? All of that, if those are supports that are in your child's IEP, then they need to get those to you. We can no longer say, oh, well, we can't get into school, or we don't have access to that. Now they have to. So all of those things, you need to have them at home, and you need to have those things that can be worked on. That includes things like the assisted communication device. I've had a lot of parents who have had issues with that. Because, one of the issues I have even in-person learning is I'm always asking who's responsible for this? Who's going to be updating this device? And a lot of times nobody knows. And so, to work effectively, it should be updated for the new book that is being read, or, for whatever is being worked on in the science class, or things like that. So, I will put in to an IEP who's responsible for updating it and what kind of updates will be made. Those same things need to be made in assisted communication devices. Okay, who's going to update it? Visuals. If your student has visuals, they need to laminate those visuals. They probably already have them, and they need to get them to you. If your child needs a schedule to follow, they need to make that schedule with the distance learning schedule for you, with the Velcro and the pull-off icons and things like that. They need to make that for you. Do they need behavioral incentive charts? They need to make that for you. Do they need breaks? They need to include those breaks within their Zoom meetings. And so one of the things about that is, and I'm going to jump ahead just one thing, but we want to ask for the parent training on those issues, okay? So they can have their behavior support team train you on how to use the first this, then charts, and how to use the incentive charts. And they can train you on how to use the visuals and the schedule and those kinds of things. They can train you on how to use the communication device, and just various things like that. So for instance, some students who do have weighted vests, you have to leave them on a certain time and up. So they can do that. And those are things that they have to be able to do. They have to train you on certain things, and it has to go beyond just saying, well, if your student can't pay attention, that's up to you. There has to be, and this goes back to the daily live interaction, okay? There's got to be that daily live interaction. Students, the teachers have to be a part of this, okay? So parents are home with your students, I understand that, but the teachers have to be interactive with these supports, okay? That the aide can take a group aside, or take your student aside during the whole class Zoom and work and reiterate the word, give those directions in a variety of ways, work with the parent, with the teacher and the parent in enforcing the behavior plan, and saying, okay, today you're going to earn this, and what are you earning? And then working with the parent saying, okay, I think he earned this. So there has to be that interaction now. so that it's not just about a teacher sitting up there and giving this information and teaching something and then expecting the parent to act as everything in one. I know many parents are, but you know, you need to be able to ask for, and you can ask for now, some training in this. How do you do it? What are the words that you use in when you are working in with my student in your classroom? You know, what kind of charts do you use, and what kind of incentives are you using? And they need to get you those materials and those things, and they need to interact with you for all of those things. When there's a break, they can help you out. Have them help you out, and you know, you can ask for time to Zoom with a teacher alone, or the behavior specialist, or things like that, so they can help you set up a quiet place for, you know, for a break time. And then they can, you know, when you are on the Zoom class, they can be the one to say, hey, I can see you're not paying attention, or you're having some issues. You know, maybe you can go sit here for a few minutes, and then, oh, it's time to come back. They can set the timer themselves, and, you know, and then when it goes off, then you're telling your child it's time to come back. So it can be very, very interactive, and they need to provide those kinds of things. And I know one of the questions was about what's an adequate time for those things, okay? There's no timeline set out. There's just like, there's no actual hours that they have to be on Zoom or have to be, but it has to be appropriate. Okay, and if your student is not able to access their education without these things, then again, those are things that you keep track of, because in a second I'll talk about compensatory, and those are things that you're going to be saying, hey, the longer it takes for you to be able to get me those things, you know, the longer, then those are compensatory issues that you're going to have to account for. So I would say that that's the way you should phrase it to them, is that, you know, I need these things. And again, so if you're calling an IEP and they're saying, well, it's going to take 30 days, you can still document all of this in an email to the program specialist, to the teacher, to the principal, to the case manager, and say, hey, my student can't access their education because like I said, these things are already in their IEP. So it's not like you really need to call an IEP to get those things. So document it in an email and say, hey, they need these things. Here's their accommodations. They should have these things. They don't have them. He can't access his education. And then when I talk about, you know, document what's working and not working, those are the things you're going to do. Send an email out right now and document to, again, case manager, principal, program specialist, what didn't work, what you had struggles with, what didn't work during the previous distance time, and ask them to address those issues, and how are we going to go going forward. So you can ask for a personalized distance learning plan, even if they won't hold an IEP for you. Say, I want something in writing, you know, exactly what is going to happen, not just, oh, 2 hours of Zoom, Monday and Thursday, and then speech. No, what is my student going to get? Is it going to be individualized speech? How are the accommodations going to be in there? What goals are going to be worked on? You can request that before you even get an IEP meeting for that. And so at any rate, that's what I feel is really important about getting that, getting the accommodations, and really getting that interaction, really prevailing upon teachers to, you know, that they cannot just sit. And it's a funny thing, because somebody said that to me today, a parent, that, you know, that it seemed like where the teacher used to work with their student, that suddenly when they get on the computer, they feel like they don't know what to do anymore. And so they become very impersonal, and they don't know how to interact with these students on a one-to-one basis. And it's something that they really need to learn. And it's something that you can point out that needs to be done. They need to be able to see each student and say, and know what each student's accommodations are, and they should know this anyhow, and how you're going to meet those accommodations. Tom, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. This law now says that we have to discuss my student's regression their learning loss and how you're going to address it. What are you going to do to address this loss? And if they don't, again, you ask for a prior written notice, and then, yes, then you can file for a due process because they refuse to do it, but it is something that they have to address now. Okay, so you're going to ask specifically. So you don't want things in the IEP like, well, the district is going to enact, hire more aides and hire. I don't want to know in my students' IEP what the district is going to do for all students. I want to know what they're going to do for my students. So what are the actions and the strategies that they're going to use for your students' loss and to accelerate the learning progress for your student? So this whole presentation has talked about, there's really two issues that you can divide it up. And the first issue is going forth, what do we do? And so I talked a little bit about that, getting your IEP, getting your data, figuring out what is needed and how to use those accommodations and having them account for those things and distance learning going forward. The second part of this, though, is what do you do about that learning loss and that regression? Okay, so again, you have the right to say what services did and didn't work. And if you're keeping data on that, and somebody had a question about whether you can videotape, you can videotape your student. You don't need to include the person on the computer, but you can absolutely videotape your student participating in the Zoom meeting and participating in distance learning and showing that they're sliding off the chair and they're rolling around under the table. And you can also keep a running log on it too, saying, hey, this is what happened. He sat down, because that really, when a psychologist does an observation or a speech pathologist, that's what they're doing too. They're saying, okay, I walked in and I saw he sat there for 5 minutes and then he started fidgeting and then he got up and walked around. And so you can keep that running log too, but you can absolutely videotape it. I wouldn't worry about whether you get a few minutes of their audio in it, but you cannot fully audio tape them. So because of privacy rights, you can't outright audio tape with it, but you can definitely videotape without audio too. And you can say, this is how he looked when this, and you can give your own running commentary in writing. This is what was happening. The teacher was saying this, and he was doing this. But I would say, definitely you need to keep those records and keep that data, and you can definitely videotape. So if we're sitting here and we're saying, okay, this is what I feel the loss is, and again, once if they do assessments or if you have to get them done individually on your own, come back to the table and you say, look, this is where he was, this is where he is now, these goals, not even close to being, before school was out, he was close to getting these, he's regressed in this and that. What are you going to do about it?
Yoshi, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
She had an IEP this morning and they basically just kind of put it off. It was, oh, we'll discuss that, a month into school, we'll talk about it later. I suspect that might happen with a lot of IEPs where the IEP team sort of punts and just sort of puts it off, the discussion. How would you advise a parent to deal with that situation?
Right. Again, if you've been keeping some data on your own, if you've had your private BCBA in, you have some data to bring to the table and say, look, I have, I want to discuss it now because I have some concerns. So I would make sure that they note those concerns in the IEP and that they can't put it off. If you're asking for an assessment, they have 14 days to give you an assessment plan. If they refuse, then you can ask for the IEE. So they really can't tell you, well, let's wait for a while, to see or to take that. No, you're asking now for them to do their assessments, for them to take the data. And you're also wanting them to put then in the IEP that they have no data. So if you come to the table with all this data showing regression and they say, well, we don't really have any data on that, they need to note that in the IEP. If they have no data and you have data and you're requesting it and they're still saying, again, you request a prior written notice because they're refusing, to do an assessment, and you get that done privately. Okay, so once you come back and you determine what the loss is, and then you put the ball back in their court and say, hey, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to do it? And we don't want the overall, we know that there is a learning continuity plan, so you have to have some things, some details and money set aside and a plan. How are you going to use that for my students' particular loss? Okay, so, let's talk about the services and support. I don't want you to continue with these services that caused the regression in the first place. It's something needs to change. If you couldn't access and couldn't meet goals all along because the services were delivered in this manner, then clearly you need to show me how you're going to change those services or those supports and make them so that they can begin to make progress, but also how to also be mitigating that loss during this time. Okay, and so we want to know what actions, what strategies, what are they going to learn and use? What kind of programs? Like maybe your student has regressed so much that they actually need a reading program to help with some of their language arts. I think that we want to be very specific in the IEP about what those regressions are for all of the goals. Note, that the baselines have changed for all of the goals, or that they are no longer making the same amount of progress. You go back and you look at any progress reports that you got before distance learning, and you say, look, they were making pretty steady progress towards this goal, and suddenly they have made no progress in the last 6 months. So
what about, Yoshi?
Yes.
What about a situation where the parent, went out and got private services? I mean, let's say there was no speech language offered during distance learning. They went out and paid for their own provider.
And then I think that you have to then say, hey, the district cannot claim that progress as their own. If you did not get those services, then I think, and again, what you will need is, your private provider will have to be adding their comments and their observations and say, hey, when he came to me, this is what he could do. He could no longer do this. He wasn't able to do this. And I think that is something that also, now my feeling is that the district will compel you to go to due process to recover any fees, but I think it is something that can be done because of the fact that, if you can show, if you've got the data to show, and again, you can request provider logs. You can absolutely prevent, and if you get provider logs during that time where they were like, yeah, we didn't do anything, then you can show that any progress that was made was due to private, providers. So I think that is absolutely something that you will ask them to mitigate too, is that, hey, I had to pay for this because all I got was, was the joke of the day instead of real therapy. So you want to talk about the level and the quality of that virtual programming too. It's like, hey, for some reason the teacher could never get her microphone to work. I don't know about you guys, but I have had meeting after meeting where we've just gone round and round and round. Those things, they have to address that. If every time the teacher comes on and it's all staticky or something, hey, we might need to have the IT person come out and teach that teacher how to, because there's certain things on Zoom that you can't have two people logged in at the same time in the same room, or you can't have the two devices and things like that. So, yeah, we really want to be able to, to talk about that. And again, in this compensatory, okay, what kinds of things are you going to want to consider? A huge thing is this one-on-one aid issue, okay? And your student that needs this, and it's very hard. And like I said, we have to really work, and the district needs to work harder on integrating the teachers and the school personnel with your student and with, all of these accommodations. But how do you mitigate this loss? How do you advocate for that student that needs the one-on-one aid that you're actually, making? So a couple of things. There are, especially in Northern California, but more and more here, there are people who have been successful in getting regional center to fund an aid, because regional center is payer of last resort. So if you can show that your student had a one-on-one aid in the classroom, but because of whatever reason, they're not getting it at home and they are suffering for it, they can be prevailed upon, and they have already in certain cities paid for an aide. The second thing is, yes, there are some, if you hire aide and then go later on and ask for compensatory. Okay. If you are acting yourself as a one-on-one aide, I mean, that's something I think the attorneys will have to figure out whether you can ask for any compensatory with that. But if you just did everything you could and you couldn't get your student to attend and you needed to go out and get somebody more professional or somebody else that could do that, then I think you would have a case for compensatory. But I think what you want in the meantime in the IEP is to really say, hey, how are we going to utilize that aide? We don't just want the aide to break off and sing some songs with kids. They need to be doing what's in the accommodation. They need to be taking the notes. They need to be breaking off into individual. And so if, before your student had, say, a 1-on-3 aide, maybe they need to change that to a 1-on-1 where your student gets 1-on-1 time with the aide after the Zoom meeting with the teacher to address, some of these issues and to go over, making sure that the accommodations are being done. Okay. And so those are kinds of things that you want to, you really want to make sure that they have that interaction. Okay. And so in considering what does your student need? Okay. Because again, I think a lot of your parents, it's going to be up to you in a lot of ways, and consulting with advocates and attorneys too, but figuring out what your child needs, because they're not going to come right out. They're going to have this overall learning continuity plan, which compels them to look for regression and find ways for me, but they're not going to come right out to an IEP and say, we're going to give you more speech, we're going to give you more this or that. So you need to ask for those things. And the first thing is figuring out what, in addition to what your student has now, what else will they need in the IEP? Okay, so has your student developed depression, anxiety, a loss of communication and social skills that they didn't have before? Were there goals that again, a falsehood where parents were told, well, they're not going to work on some of the goals. We don't have to work on some goals. That's not true. So did they go for months without goals being worked on? So what, other than what's already in the IEP, what else is something that you need to add? So consider adding behavior support. Consider adding a 1-on-1 when maybe they didn't have the 1-on-1. Consider having a 1-on-1 if they had a 3-on-1 before, because it's going to be a whole difficult situation coming back if they go back into in-person and being out. Consider adding counseling and getting a behavior plan done. So those are kinds of things that you want to add. Maybe your student has never gone to ESY before, but maybe they need to. And again, right now the battle always is for ESY. It's only special education, and it's only for those who are functioning at the lowest level, and yada yada yada. And it's only for maintaining and not maintaining skills and not working on new things. This is a whole new ballgame. You have a right to say, look, he needs more time. He needs more SAI time. He needs these things. And the law is saying it's to mitigate the loss and to accelerate the learning. So ESY, we want to have worked on the goals that weren't worked on, or we want to have it to be a time of accelerated learning. So that's something that you can consider also, okay? And extra assessments. So maybe, maybe there were assessments that they didn't think you needed in the beginning, but maybe now you need them. So, so you want to consider services that weren't normally there that you might need to add. In addition, what's already there that needs to be added to. So you may need, if all you got was a speech pathologist checking in once a day saying, hey, how's everybody doing? I'm going to read you a story, and that's that. And they can't account for any goals being worked on. Or if your student did not have access to the proper communication device for all these months, request more speech services. And again, because sometimes our students can't handle an accelerated amount, so we can't just throw all of these new services in and more services. Again, ESY. ESY is a perfect time for that. I want my student in ESY so that they can learn again, because they were just beginning to learn how to use the assistive communication communication device, and then we didn't get it brought home. So again, thinking out of the box, okay? I'm sorry, just popped. ESY, extended school year. So basically what we used to call summer school. It's extended school year. And well, years ago when I was working in special ed, everybody got it. Everybody just went to summer school for special education. Now it's only for if you meet certain requirements. And one is regression. Hello. And the other one is if you are in the middle of learning a new fundamental skill that would be lost if you didn't get it. So there's several things, and it's not just regression, but I think, here you can argue regression for almost all of our students. And so I think even students that didn't get ESY before can get that. Yes, somebody mentioned recoupment too. Yes, so it's for, one of the ways they measure is like, hey, so when your student comes back after break or after summer or after Christmas break or after spring break, how long does it take them to recoup anything that they've lost and to get back on track? And if it's, a normal amount of time, then they haven't really regressed and they don't have any trouble recouping their skills. But in this case, I think there's so much loss that they're going to have trouble. Every student is going to have trouble, recouping these things because we're coming back and we're still on distance learning, at least for a period of time. So that's something to keep in mind, that you can request that extra time. Okay. So those are the kinds of things you're going to want to look for compensatory. Asking for extra services that aren't normally there on your IEP, asking for an increase in OT. Maybe up till now OT and has been consult. Well, you know what? Maybe that didn't work at all, and because you didn't get any of the accommodations that you normally get for OT, like a slant board or adapted paper, maybe they need to go to direct services for a little while. So those are the kinds of things that you want to really talk about for mitigating those losses, okay, and for getting that. So a couple of things in kind of going back over some of this stuff, you need to really be able to ask for IEs and prior written notices and all things, because there's no guarantee that the teachers, even some of the program specialists, will even be aware of this new legislation. And again, talking about compensatory strategies and compensatory education is not something that they are used to or that they have been told normally that they should even address. So these are some things you may want to ask for IEPs, to have a program specialist present and email them a copy of this bill beforehand to let them know that this is something you want to discuss. I do want to address.
Yoshi, can I just ask one question too? And you've got this learning continuity and attendance plan that's going to be due by September 30th. It has to be published, on their website, accessible to parents. And one strategy might be to print that out and pass it out to each member of the IEP team and say, okay, well, here's how your district said, you were going to address loss in this area, and just make it personal to your child. Okay, let's talk about my child. How are you going to address the learning loss in this fashion that you outlined under the law? Let's bring it down to my child. So, it's going to steer the team towards the requirement, because this is a document that was generated by the district itself.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I want to address real quickly the possibility of going back. Well, let's hope it's more than a possibility of going back to in-person learning, and how you can also address that even before you do that. I talked to a parent recently who had some fears because they said, their student is an eloper. She runs away. And so the school is talking about, we're going to hold all these things outside and classes outside. How can you guarantee that she's not going to run to the next pod and to the next cohort and to the, and those kinds of things. And she won't wash her hands, or she won't wear a mask, or she won't do these things. These are things that you can have a safety plan in the IEP. You have a right to say, I want to know personally, what is the sanitation measures looking like? What is this classroom looking like? Do they have a supply of disinfecting soap? Do they have masks? Do they have these things, and then insist on that, here, my student has an issue with this, so somebody needs to take them this many times, and wash their hands and using this. Or I do know a student who is actually allergic to hand sanitizer. So those are things you want to put in there that, when every student lines up there 4 times a day to do hand sanitizer, not my student, they need to be allowed to go to the sink and wash with soap and water. So make sure you have that plan prepared for before they go back into the classroom. What is it going to look like? What is your cohort going to look like? How is speech and OT and those kinds of services going to look? Because it's very clear that it says, when that happens, they can come to you and do one-to-one service, but they cannot pull out all the kids and do a small group together because that's no longer in a cohort. So how are these things going to be addressed? Transportation is huge. How is transportation going to be addressed? How is social distancing going to be on the bus? How is that going to work? And maybe they need to have an aide on the bus to ensure if your student already has documented issues with not always sitting in their seats, or there's other kids that have that, maybe they need to get an aide on that bus to ensure that. So these are all things that you want to have in a plan for when they come back. One of the questions I know that we have a lot about is the general ed students and how that works. And again, general ed teachers are giving their Zoom meetings and they're saying, hey, I just do a one-on Zoom meeting. Well, you know what? They are still, and this is why in all of my IEP meetings for students who are in general ed settings too, in inclusion or full general ed, I talk about the teachers taking ownership of these students. So in-person learning, and I find this is a problem a lot, that the teachers don't take charge of that student. So they'll often expect the aide to handle everything. Well, this can't happen anymore because we're in distance. So teachers have to be, that's something you have to note in the IEP, that the general ed teacher has to also provide those accommodations, has to be able to see when your student might need a break, ask for those clarifications, give repeated instructions, those kinds of things. And then again, that there should be time set up for breakaway with the one-on-one aid, with the SAI, either before, after, whatever. If students have access to, front loading of vocabulary, then maybe the SAI in some form needs to meet with them before. And again, teachers need to get them the notes. So those kinds of things still has to happen. That is another falsehood that I've heard, is that, well, they can't get access to general ed, they have to do one or the other. And that is not true. They can absolutely do both, and it has to be done. Again, the general ed teachers have to, and legally can be compelled to provide the accommodations during that. Mm. So,
good point.
Yeah, so I'm going to start going through some of these questions. If I haven't answered any of your questions and you have more.
Can I stop the slideshow?
Yes, absolutely. If you have any questions that I didn't answer, feel free to jot them down again in the chat. I'm trying to scroll through this and see. I think I answered a lot of them. But I think that, one of the biggest issues, again, is that one-on-one. And I think we really, really have to compel the district to utilize that one-to-one, again, for, they have to find ways to utilize it more effectively. Okay, and what I've seen a lot is just, well, the aide then breaks off and sings some songs. That's not okay. What was the aide used for before? And those things can still be done. Again, you cannot compel the district to send somebody out, but you can get, again, a form of compensatory later on. Hey, my student needs extra tutoring after school because he didn't have the aid, so he got behind because he couldn't access some of this curriculum because there was nobody taking notes for him. There was nobody front loading the vocabulary. There was nobody, teaching him in a one-to-one setting. So, so I think, they have to utilize the aids as best they can, and they can. That is something that can be done. And then they have to have the discussion about compensatory for those students who had, and again, if you needed an aid because your student has behaviors, and those behaviors exist at home because you didn't get any, because everything is chaotic and all of this, yes, then you can request extra behavior services too. And that's one thing that they can provide during distance learning is, the behavior support, because most behavior specialists, private behavior specialists, are working. So again, go through a regional center to see about getting an aide, possibly hire one on your own, and seek compensatory for it later. But document it, document it, document it, document it. Send them an email and say, look, I have tried this, this, and this. I've requested this. Nobody's helping me with, I don't have any visuals. I don't have his behavior chart. I have tried, this is, this and this is happening. He can't attend for more than 5 minutes. He's regressed here and there. So I am hiring my own behavior specialist or my own aide, and I will be seeking, compensation from the district at a later time. Let them know that, that you tried everything. Document what you tried. And again, people asked about, there were questions about the, if your student didn't appear to have it regress as much because parents helped or private people helped, document that. Document what you had to do and what you had to do it without any support, because even though your student maybe still made progress, I think that they still have to account for the fact that they didn't provide certain things, and that your student made some progress, but you had to pay for private services in order to do it. Then that's something that you definitely can get compensated for at a later time. Let's see.
Yoshi, there's one question about comparing this person's child to typically developing peers,
yes.
And that is regression. Recoupment is more or less the same as other students.
And again, that's not legal. That's why they call it is still an individualized IEP. And so that's why I'm saying, although the district has to submit a learning continuity plan and the government has issued distance learning guidelines and regulations, it is still an individualized educational plan. So that's why I'm saying we take those things that now they have to do and say, how does this for my student? So
yeah, and I would just say too, you might hear that, like you might hear them quip something like, well, everybody suffered some learning loss. Well, that's not the point.
Then you have to recoup everybody.
Exactly. Well, the point is, they have to consider your child's regression individually. And where was your child before the closure? Where is your child now? How significant is that regression? And if so, they've got to try to come up with a plan to make up that educational loss.
Right. And an interesting thing about the bill is that it really doesn't it doesn't set a standard that your student must have regressed this far in order to have the district consider any recoupment. So I think, we really, they can't come back and say, well, it wasn't enough. Also, it doesn't have anything to do with typically developing peers. I've had that in normal IEPs where I've been doing Zoom IEPs and they'll say, well, everybody's suffering at this time. Nobody's, well, great. And then everybody can come and address that with your principal. But right now we're addressing it for this student, and this student has these issues, and you need to address that individually. So they cannot, and they can't anyways. An IEP, they can't, and I've had that even in meetings in person where they'll say, well, when we'll say, well, this student is having these issues in class, and what, all my students have these issues. And some of you here who are actually my clients have probably heard me say these things like, well, just because you can't properly address some of these students doesn't make it okay, so just because a teacher can't handle any of the behaviors doesn't mean it's okay that they all have behaviors, so they don't have to address any behaviors. So yes, so they cannot compare your child to any typical developing peers or to any other special education students, and this bill really doesn't. And I think for that very reason, say they don't set a standard, a bar that your child has to prove this much regression before we start talking about any recoupment, or they have to prove that it was more or anything like that. So yeah, let's see. Yeah, okay, so there was a question about what parents can request to support the distance learning at home. The disability makes it incredibly difficult for them to focus on screen, unmute himself, click on links. Again, if you have a student that has, say, visual issues, and your student normally got enlarged keyboards, or we're in the process of learning how to use the computer, or they, needed to have the magnified screen on the computer. Those are things that they need to have now. You need to be able to ask for those things, and and to be able to say, hey, what are your suggestions? How can this happen? How can we, and it may be that somebody calls the student up and says, here, this is what you do, or gives those instructions, but those are things that they're going to have to account for.
Yeah, there's one question, Yoshi. What if they push to generic group office hours of teachers or learning specialists as a time to provide specific SAI in the IEP? I assume the person's asking about, kind of like a study skills group or homework helper,
Right.
where you
Right.
just make an appointment.
What you have to be careful is that it has to be individualized. The bill was very clear that the cohorts, first of all, you have to be in the same cohort, so they can't be pulling kids out and putting them in different groups when they go back to learning. But when you're doing distance learning and you're saying, okay, we're just going to Zoom with it, first of all, it must be a special education teacher. It must be qualified if your student is mod severe or mild mod. It must be a properly credentialed teacher that's working and overseeing that. You must have, they must be working on the same kinds of goals. They must be working on the same kinds of things. And if it's geared towards that and towards making progress, then it would be okay. But if not, no, that's not an option, just to pull them out and say, oh, generically, we're just going to stick a bunch of kids here. And, no, it has to be construed to make progress.
One of the last questions is, does this also apply to charter schools?
Yes, a charter school is a public school, and so everything applies to the same thing to a charter school that it would apply to in the public schools. Yes. Yes, you can ask for your students to be assessed again in less than a year if you do virtual assessments now. Yes, because things may have changed. There are some assessments that have requirements that you can't do the same you can't do that assessment within a year, but there's other forms of it. So yes, if you have concerns and questions, you can ask for assessments at any time. As far as an FBA, yes, I think there are behavior specialists privately that can do it, and it can be done in a school district setting too, online, just to address some of the behaviors that apply directly to distance learning.
Yeah, I would just mention too, we haven't talked about this, but tape record every IEP meeting. As long as you give the school district at least 24 hours before the meeting that you are going to tape record, it is your legal right. You don't even have to ask for permission. And it's so helpful. I mean, it frees you up to listen. You don't have to be taking scrupulous notes. The recorder will catch everything. And if you get into a problem in the future, believe me, it'll really, really help to document what happened. You know how little is written in the document versus what is said, and what is said is so important. So I really encourage you to tape record every IEP meeting.
Yeah, and you give them 24 hours notice in writing that you're going to record it, and then you can record it.
Great.
So that's basically everything that I have to say.
Yes. Well, thank you for your attention. It's been a couple of hours of a lot of information, and we just thank you for attending, and glad that you could participate in this. I will mention, go on the My Special Needs Connection website. It's www.myspecialneedsconnection. Sign up for the newsletter. We have free webinars from different experts in the community. We're going to have various resources, etc. And it's free to join. So check out the website. Yoshi founded it, and get on the free newsletter list to get updated information.
Remember, it's constantly changing. Like I said, different school districts. If you have a student in middle school or high school, your student is going to be on distance learning for longer than an elementary school student will be. So just keep that in mind. And again, the website, somebody asked about that. It's My Special Needs Connection. Tom, you might want to type that in the comment. Type it in. But yeah, so this is an ongoing thing. And then even when they do come back in person again, you need to have that plan for safety. And we don't know if they're going to go back out again, if we have a resurgence of the virus. And they still have to mitigate the losses. They can't just say, well, we're just going forward from here. Let's just call this all just even Steven, let's not worry about it. That's not okay. And so this is constantly changing, constantly evolving, and we really have to constantly be sending these emails out to document this. Nope, sorry, I know you sent this home. This isn't working. This isn't the right size. This isn't working. We're still having these issues. I need training in this. I need, because it's very clear from this bill and from what, the federal and state government has said that from here on in, this needs to be for progress. This needs to be as close to real life education as we can get with progress.
We'll probably do a follow-up because I know, the law's changing, situations are changing. So maybe in a few months or so, we'll do an update.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for attending. Have a great night.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.